sensitive to staying within all of our spending limits, and we wanted to make sure that we did that, which of course we've done. The second thing is that we have contingent in this budget $5 billion for dispatchable thermal generation. There's $1.5 billion for broadband. There's $3 billion for a new higher education endowment. And as we started to add up the total amount, we had to make adjustments so that we fit within our overall budget.
Okay. The last thing I want to touch on this subject, going back to the line items that on here that did not pass this particular time, which is formula funding, teacher compensation, school choice, and virtual education. And you said the budget doesn't require us to pass a bill that ties any two together. So that $500 million, that's a line item in the budget for school choice, hypothetically, if the body passed a vote to pay teachers and not do an ESA, is that $500 million fungible?
It could technically be moved with approval between the strategies.
Thank you very much for clearing that up for me, Dr. Bond. And I'm almost done. Do you remember April 6th, I'm sure? It was probably your favorite day of the session. And there was an amendment. It was Amendment 45, otherwise known as the Herrera Amendment, that was adopted in HB 1. That amendment was adopted 86 to 52 with 11 P and Bs. Was that amendment direction from this body that we were not going to spend state dollars on vouchers or ESAs, as we call them today? Is that the way you understood the amendment?
That amendment is not in HB 1 now.
That leads me to my next question. So the body put the amendment on, and I know things change, and particularly you've explained the process of how you got to what you're presenting for a vote today. What was the process to strip an amendment? Did the Appropriates Committee take that vote? I know the body didn't take the vote. In fact, we've had about 3 votes on this subject, is why we don't have a bill today, as you're well aware. I was just wondering, is that something that's just a policy decision made when you're working backwards on what stays in and what doesn't?
No, that is a difference between the House and Senate versions. And of course, you can only have one budget in the final analysis. So you've got to, that's part of the conference, just as any other piece of legislation where you're negotiating the differences between 2 bills.
Okay. So, and finally, Dr. Bonin, and you did a great job at the very beginning explaining this, but I want to get it very clear on the record, because I am voting for the budget you're presenting us. And once again, I thank you for your work. By taking the vote for this budget, are we voting for a voucher or an ESA?
No, that will have to be done in separate legislation.
And that $500 million that's in the budget right now that is set aside for an ESA could be fungible at some point. It doesn't have to go to an ESA.
It doesn't have to go anywhere. It could sit there and lapse. It could potentially be used for other purposes, but it can't be used for an ESA without ESA legislation passing.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers, and I will be voting for your budget, Dr. Bonin. Thank you for your work. I appreciate you.
Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
The gentleman yield for questions. The gentleman yields for questions.
Thank you, Representative Bonin. So it was mentioned in the discussion you just had with Representative King that the $5 billion we set aside that an increase in the basic allotment would come out of has been reduced to $3.9 billion, and that's now in Article 9. Do you know what that would translate into if we were to pass some authorizing legislation in terms of an increase in the basic allotment?
So you're asking if every single dollar were to go into the basic allotment, how much of an increase would that be?
No, I'm asking what's allowed under the $3.9 billion. What's the biggest increase that's allowed? Because I know they're itemized in that $3.9 billion.
Well, it would be $3.9 billion.
It would be the entirety of the $3.9 billion
could go
into the basic allotment.
It doesn't specify whether it's basic allotment, small or mid-size allotment, teacher incentive allotment, teacher residencies. That would be at the discretion of the body and of the authors of the legislation.
Okay. Is there anywhere else in the budget where we could pull money from to increase the basic allotment? Say, for instance, if we were to come back in a special session?
There is no contingency for that.
Okay. You could have authorized, just in the appropriations budget, an increase in the basic allotment instead of doing a contingency rider. Is that correct?
So we can increase the basic allotment. We've taken the approach that our school finance formulas live in statute. That's generally been under the purview of the Public Education Committee. And certainly an advantage of the basic allotment is it provides the most discretion to our districts. A disadvantage is that it provides the most discretion to our districts. And so, for example, teacher pay being a big issue. Currently, in statute, 30% of the basic of an increase in the basic allotment must go toward increasing pay, but only 75% of that goes to teachers, librarians, counselors, and nurses. So 22.5% of an increase in the basic allotment would actually make its way into salary increases for those professionals. And in addition to that, that doesn't have to be an increase in pay. That could be used to hire additional professionals, which doesn't actually raise the pay of those who are already employed. So if the goal is to increase teacher pay, that is not the most efficient strategy for doing that. So sure, you could always increase the basic allotment, but depending on what your goals are, that might not be the best way to say increase school safety, increase teacher pay, increase curriculum funding, increase any number of items in Pub Ed. That's why we have legislation that addresses those specific concerns.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the school safety allotment. House Bill 1 has $300 million allocated for the school safety, for an increase. Is that for an increase in the school safety allotment, or is that for the school safety allotment in its entirety?
Yeah, so there's $1.4 billion for school safety between the supplemental and House Bill 1. So in the supplemental, there's $1.1 billion, and that is contemplated as a grant structure. And with the focus being on, number one, getting every campus in the state up to the new TEA minimum standards for school safety. And we project that to be roughly $800 million, which is on top of the $400 million which we put toward this strategy in budget execution last fall. So that's about $1.2 billion total. And then there's another $300 million that could be used, again, in grants for school safety strategies above and beyond the minimum requirements, or what we expect campuses are going to be or need to do to get up to those minimum requirements. In each of the last two biennium, or the current biennium and the previous one, we had approximately $50 million per year in the school safety allotment. So that's about $100 million. This would triple that, and that would be formula funding. So that would be money that goes into the districts. Now, in House Bill 3, the school safety legislation that is still alive and being negotiated, and I think hopefully we'll take up on a conference committee report tomorrow, they will address what to do with the school safety allotment. I don't want to say what the final outcome will be. I think it still may be per capita, but with a minimum for campuses, so that small campuses with a smaller enrollment have some minimum amount that they receive. So, but that's the breakdown of the $1.4 billion in new money between HB 1 and SB 30, 1.1 in grants, and 300 in formula.
Right, and so that 300 translates into what? Because that's like the basic allotment. There's complete, almost complete, but there's local school district discretion to spend that $300 million. It's a per student expenditure. Yeah. What does that translate into?
Well, I don't have that number in front of me, but it's it's so permissive that we don't even know for sure they spend it on school safety. It really is more money into district budgets, which is fine, but to my knowledge, no one is then auditing to see that every dollar they receive from the school safety allotment was spent on school safety.
Okay. I know there are parameters in statute about how that is supposed to be used for. My notes say that we're only increasing the student safety allotment by 28 cents.
Gentleman's time's expired. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2432, suspending the limitation of the conferees for HB 3447. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2433, suspending the limitation on the conferees for SB 10. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2436, suspending the limitation on the conferees for HB 4227. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2435, suspending the limitation of the conferees for HB 357. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2440, suspending the limitation of the conferees for HB 17. Pursuant to Rule 13, Section 9F of the House Rules, the Chair announces the introduction of H.R. 2462, suspending the limitation of the conferees for SB 12. Dr. Rogers, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, could we have the conversations between Chairman Bonin and Chairman King and Representative Hinojosa reduced to writing and placed in the journal?
Members of the motion objecting, Chair has unsorted. The Chair recognizes Ms. Martinez-Fisher in opposition to HB 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I appreciate the layout from Chair Bonin, and I appreciate the work that he and the members of the Appropriations Committee did on a lot of this budget. I also am a member of the Appropriations Committee, and I'm very proud of a lot of sections in that budget. We have a lot to be proud of in some of the major investments that were made, transformational change, new ideas to be big and bold in areas of higher ed and community colleges, and come up with a plan to purchase parks and to have a park expansion, to deal with flooding, to deal with construction of Ike Dike. There are a number of things that we should be very, very proud of. And I really wish that in this budget, at least this session, that we could vote for this budget article by article. I wish we could pull up Article 1, take a vote on government, pull up Article 2, take a vote on health and human services, pull up Article 3, and take a vote on public education, because it's in the public education space that I have the biggest heartburn. It's in the public education space that when I hear Chair Bonin lay out his perspective, it just doesn't pencil with me. I listened very carefully, and I think what he said was we are making a record investment in public education. And if you're voting for this budget, you are voting for the greatest investment in pub ed. But when I look at the basic allotment, which is the driver of the funding for our schools, it's actually the same amount of money it was 2 years ago. And that's the same amount of money it was 2 years before that. And it was the same amount of money 2 years before that, because the last time we touched the basic allotment was in 2019. And so I'm trying to figure out, if we're making a massive investment in public education, and the basic allotment is the driver of the dollars in public education, then where is it going? And when you look in Article 9 on these contingencies for $17 billion, there's $12 billion going into tax cuts. We had this conversation during House Bill 1 floor debate that some say $12 billion for public education is also tax cuts, that's an appropriate expense because it puts state dollars in. It doesn't go into the classroom. Money for a tax cut does not put gasoline in the school bus. Money for a tax cut does not replace the oven in the cafeteria when it breaks. $12 billion for tax cuts does nothing to fix the leaking roof in the gym or to help pay for food service workers, bus drivers. I know that there's also another contingency for school safety. We've talked about a little bit, $5 billion or so. But what I worry is that there is no safety net if these contingencies in Article 9 do not come to pass. We should at least have a safety net to say that we would take that money that we thought was going one place and we can put it in the basic allotment. That is not in this budget, and that is concerning to me. And I also know that while we've parked some money for property tax cuts, we don't even have a property tax plan. We have a very strong plan in this House that I proudly supported for appraisal caps and homestead exemptions. Senate has a different idea, and unless...
Mr. Speaker,
Dr. Bonner, for what
would
purpose?
the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield for questions.
I yield.
The gentleman yields for questions.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to understand, your perspective on this. Would you say that $2.36 billion in increased funding for our schools through increased yield on the golden penny yield, is that going into the classroom?
It's not going in the classroom like a basic allotment increase
So
would.
tell me why it doesn't go into the classroom.
Well, I'm saying that it does, but I'm saying it doesn't go into the classroom like a basic allotment. So I guess we have a preference differential.
How does it not go into the classroom the way the basic allotment goes into the classroom?
Yes. I'm sorry?
How is that so? How is it that it doesn't go into the classroom the way the basic allotment would go into the classroom?
My belief and my understanding is the money in the basic allotment affords school districts the most flexibility to invest those dollars.
And do they spend all of those dollars in the classroom?
No.
They don't. Okay, interesting. The $3.2 billion for enrollment growth, does that go into the classroom?
It does.
It does. Okay. And the $1.4 billion for school safety, will that go into our schools?
Ultimately, if it passes, yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Okay. And how do you feel about the $5 billion for our public school retirees?
I believe that's fantastic, but that's not in the
So
classroom.
you're going to
sir.
vote against that?
I want to talk about public education, and that's what I'm doing, and that's what my layout is on.
Well, as you mentioned, we don't separate these things, and that is part of public education and it's part of House Bill 1. So if you vote against House Bill 1, are you not voting against the $3.2 billion of enrollment funding? Are you not voting against the $2.36 billion for increased yield on the golden penny? Are you not voting against $5 billion for our public school retirees?
I truly appreciate the gotcha questions, and if you were listening earlier, I said there are a number of things that are outstanding in this budget. I said that. That was the first thing I said. In fact, I congratulated you. Perhaps you didn't hear that. I also congratulated all the hardworking members of the committee. I am talking about Article 3. That is my singular focus. The TRS is not a classroom item that I am talking about. It is important. It is massive. You took my amendment for $900 million in the supplemental for TRS care. You know I care about TRS care, so I don't want you to misrepresent to the body. And that's why I keep talking about this basic allotment, because I'm curious and concerned that people seem to think that we need statutes and laws and we need House Bill 100 to increase the basic allotment. And I know you said something earlier about the preferences to do it in statute, and I pulled the statute on the basic allotment, section 48.051, and I read with great interest in subsection B that it says very clearly that you can set a greater amount for any school year, and that may be provided by an appropriation. And so we did not do that by appropriation. That's my concern. That's why I'm speaking out against this budget. Yeah, it is difficult, but what's also difficult is that when I go home and tour these schools, the Young Women's Leadership Academy is one street away from my house. It is mile 3 on my neighborhood jog. And when I go talk to those parents, and when I go tour those schools and talk to those teachers, I want to look them in the eye and tell them, sir, that when we did a massive investment for public education, that would be reflected in our basic allotment. And moreover, sir, what I would also tell them is that when I looked at all funds appropriated in the budget 2 years ago, we have a disagreement on this. If we look at what we appropriated 2 years ago, It was $54 billion for pub ed. If we look at what we're appropriating for the next 2 years, it is $51 billion. I'm not saying that we spent $54 billion 2 years ago. I'm saying that's what we appropriated. And so when I look at that, that's minus $3 billion. And I think my math teachers at the Young Women's Leadership Academy would call me out on that. And so that's why I feel like I'm speaking out against this.
That included in this bill is $93.6 billion in all funds for public education.
I'm not talking about all funds, sir. I'm talking about what was appropriated.
$93.6 billion.
And
in
again,
terms of new money,
and again,
not including enrollment growth, $8.668 billion into public education. Not into tax relief, into school district budgets.
and I appreciate that.
That also doesn't include the $1.1 billion for school safety.
I appreciate that. And the singular focus of my remarks has everything to do with the basic allotment.
Okay.
And
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your perspective. And we just have a different way of looking at this money and how we value it and how it matters to our public education school system. But I appreciate the dialogue. So members, we could have changed this basic allotment in this budget. We didn't do that. We did not need House Bill 100. We did not need a bill from the Senate. We know those bills are dying. We know those bills are getting tagged and held hostage with voucher proposals, ESAs, or whatever you want to call them. We didn't even need to go there. We could have just done it in this budget. And there were multiple attempts to do that, and that didn't happen. But that's okay. That is not my call. That is not the call of many people in the Appropriations Committee. But I don't think there is widespread disagreement. Outside of Article 3, you will find a number of things that you can justify your vote. As it relates to me and what I care about and what I see, I cannot justify going home at a time of record surplus, at a time with money still in the bank, at a time with $17 billion sitting in Article 9, contingent on things happening. I can't go home and look the teachers at the Young Women's Leadership Academy of Thomas Jefferson High School in my neighborhood and say that we did something for them.
Gentlemen,
I'm going to be voting no on this budget. I ask you to vote no too.
The chair recognizes Dr. Bonin to close on the conference committee report on HB 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a historic budget that makes huge investments in multiple areas, including public education. I'm happy to yield for questions.
Ms. Howard, for what purpose?
Yeah, will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Certainly.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Chairman Bonin. And I will also preface my questions by saying that I am voting for this budget. There is much in here to be very grateful for, that we worked on, that is going to help a lot of Texans. That being said, I do have some concerns, as you've heard from some of the others that have been at the back mic, and also just a couple of questions about how some decisions were made or how the priorities were decided. First off, I guess I would say we started off, I know, with a $32.7 billion surplus. That's on the books, right? That was the cash balance surplus, right?
That's, yes.
I mean, it was on the books. It wasn't like there was $32.7 billion sitting there. That was on the books.
Projected surplus for this biennium.
I'm sorry?
That was a projected surplus for this biennium.
And that projected surplus included $6.5 billion of dedicated funds, which we used to balance the budget legitimately, but are meant for being spent on something else. We just haven't spent it. It also included the benefit that the state got because of the increased property values to the tune of, I think, like $4.3 billion that we didn't spend on FSP because the property values went up, and so the state benefited again. Then we also had federal dollar swaps that we made because of COVID and so forth. I think that was about $3.8 billion. Point being that we really had lesser amount to work with than maybe seemed on the surface to be the case. And so here's where the question is. It appears that there was a leadership decision to use half of the so-called surplus of $32.7 billion to go toward property tax relief. A good goal, but at the same time, knowing that we really didn't have all of that cash sitting around, knowing that we have a spending limit that left less for other things to be spent on. Is that not correct?
So specifically with respect to property tax relief, a couple of keys. One is that increases the state's share dramatically. And so for years, we've heard the state doesn't pay enough of the cost of public education. For the very first time since I've been a part of this process, we will, as a state, be paying over 50% of the cost of the foundation school program. The second thing, which I know is important to you, or I think is recapture. And with this increased state contribution, not only is there tax relief, not only does the state share go up, but recapture will be dramatically reduced to the tune of approximately $6.9 billion. Secondly, this is an ongoing commitment. So this is not one time.
Right.
When we look at what we can afford to spend, because it is literally taking state revenues to replace local tax revenues, we don't plan to go back. So when we look to the next biennium, we have to be able to do that again, plus more. And so that is what was factored in to the size of the property tax relief, the increased state share that we could do, knowing that this is an ongoing cost to the state that we will maintain and that we will actually increase as we go forward.
But when we talk about this being an historic amount being invested in public education, absolutely, in the dollars that the state is spending, that is correct, but it's not necessarily more dollars, it's a swap.
Well, but to be clear, there's more, okay? And so that's what has been outlined specifically in this rider, and that's the $4 billion in FSP formula funding and teacher compensation.
But that we're not doing that yet, though.
Well, if the legislation passes, the money is in the budget, so I wouldn't hold the I wouldn't blame the budget. The budget makes the money available. We have to pass the legislation.
Well,
there's $1.1 billion in the supplemental for school safety, another $300 in
I've got
HB1.
that.
$2.36 billion in increased golden penny yield, $3.2 billion for enrollment growth. I mean, I can go on, but that's not tax relief. That is new money going into our school districts for their maintenance and operations.
If we get to do that. But the thing is that, and the good things in this budget, there is a lot that's being put in here to increase state salaries. I'm really pleased to see that. We have looked at doing some strategic salary increases for state employees as well. That's great. We have increased funding for our teacher retirees. Unfortunately, we didn't do what we needed to do, I think, anyway, with our state employees that are our employees. They haven't had a raise since 2001. But that being said, it feels like the teachers are being held hostage to this policy decision when we are actually doing some good things in this budget to increase salaries for everybody else, but not for the teachers.
Yeah, let me be clear. This contingency rider does not link these items. So that could be the case in other pieces of legislation. It's not the case in House Bill 1.
I will say that the good things that I'm very appreciative of, there was a lot that was done to increase funding for healthcare, and I am very grateful to Chair Jatan and for you for helping to make that happen. Significant increases in women's health care, family planning. I will ask you, though, about the amount that got put in for our community home care attendants that we worked so hard on trying to get that to $15 an hour. The House, my recollection is that the House budget did invest enough to raise those wages to $15 an hour, but the conference committee ultimately agreed to only $10.60 an hour, up from $8.11, but $10.60 an hour is still not competitive. It's good. Step in the right direction.
Just step in the right direction.
But, okay. Also, I'm grateful for the amount of money that was put into higher education. Now, let me ask you this, though. Is some of that money contingent upon the passage of HB 17 and HB 18?
So, institutional enhancement, exceptional items, higher education, new endowment are not. There's $700 million that would go toward instructional and research formula, comprehensive regional university funding, Hazelwood, higher education, group insurance. That $700 million, which would also freeze tuition and fees in the state at our public institutions for for our students, that is contingent upon the passage of the other legislation, which is different than what you see in Pub Ed, where it's not contingent on other pieces of legislation passing. It's simply contingent on the legislation that would appropriate or would create the plan to, for those monies to pass. But you can pass school safety legislation and fund school safety in this contingency rider without passing curriculum legislation and vice versa. So these items are not required. It's not as if you have to pass all of these in Pub Ed, whereas in higher ed, as you point out, that $700 million in our rider that would freeze tuition and fees is contingent upon two other pieces of legislation passing.
And what was the final amount that we were putting into community colleges out of that significant legislation that Representative Van
I
Beaver?
believe it's around $650 million.
Which is excellent. And then also there were increases in the tuition assistance program for Texas grants and for community
that's
colleges.
Right. So we increased our funding for Texas grants. The most significant increase is really probably in TEOG at the community college level. And I don't say that so much in terms of dollar amount, but in funding the demand.
They went up from like 28% of eligible students to about 70%. Is that correct?
That's correct. That is correct.
That's a huge step forward for
Yes.
sure. So I could probably ask you more. I think we're probably about out of time, but I do appreciate your talking with me about this. This is a good budget in many ways. I do think our priorities were a little skewed in terms of the property tax cuts as opposed to investing in Texans long term. And I also wish we hadn't held the teachers hostage. That being said, I will be supporting the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Move passage.
Dr. Bonin moves the House concur, adopt the conference committee report for HB 1. This is a record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Show Dr. Bonin voting aye. Show the speaker voting aye. Mr. Wally voting aye. Show Mr. Wilson voting aye. Mr. Schofield voting aye. Mr. Kemple voting aye. Show Mr. Lozano voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 124 ayes and 22 nays, the House adopts the Conference Committee Report for HB 1. The Conference Committee Report of HB 1 is adopted subject to Article 3, Section 49A of the Texas Constitution. The chair recognizes Dr. Bonin for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to suspend all necessary rules to authorize the Journal Clerk, in lieu of entering the text of the Conference Committee Report on House Bill 1, to enter a statement in the Journal that the official text of the Conference Committee Report is the text contained in the Legislative Budget Board's official printing.
Members of the motion to objection, chair has done so ordered. The chair lays out the following privilege resolution, suspending limitation on the conferees for SB 30. The clerk read the resolution.
H.R. 2340 by Bonin, suspending the limitations on the conference committee jurisdiction for SB 30.
The chair recognizes Dr. Bonin to explain the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the outside of the bounds resolution for Senate Bill 30, which is our Supplemental Appropriations Act, and I move adoption.
The question occurs on adoption of the resolution. There's a record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Show Dr. Bonin voting aye. Mr. Metcalf voting aye. Mr. Jatan voting aye. Mr. Wally voting aye. Mr. Wilson voting aye. Show Ms. Morales-Shaw voting aye. Show Ms. Bowers voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 138 ayes and 5 nays, the motion is adopted. The chair recognizes Dr. Bonin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conference Committee Report for Senate Bill 30 ensures that we pass a balanced budget for this biennium that is within. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Mr. Speaker, I call up with the Conference Committee Report on Senate Bill 30.
The chair lays out the Conference Committee Report for SB 30 and recognizes Dr. Bonin to explain the report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conference Committee Report for Senate Bill 30 is how we close the books on the current biennium. It makes sure that we stay within all of our constitutional and statutory spending limits, and it has a number of really important items that are included in it. There's $3 billion, which will capitalize our new Texas University Fund, $2.5 billion to make sure we fully fund the Medicaid program for the biennium, $2.2 billion to increase behavioral and mental health capacity and build new state hospital facilities. There is $1.3 billion to incentivize semiconductor innovation and development in Texas, $1.1 billion for school safety grant initiatives, $1 billion to capitalize the Texas Water Fund, which is created by Chairman Tracy King's legislation, $900 million, which will importantly help to pay off some of our liability for the ERS pension fund, and that will result in a savings over time of approximately $5 billion. There's $146 million to ensure that we are prepared to respond to natural disasters, $125 million for park acquisitions, and $120 million for victims of crime grants. You should have received an informational graphic provided by the LBB that itemizes many of these items, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes, thank you.
Representative Bonin, my understanding is that this bill needs a 2/3 vote of the body for some of these important items to be funded. Is that correct?
I don't know that it does require a 2/3 vote for them to be funded.
Well, I would like to know, because if it does, it will change my consideration on the vote. That's my understanding. If you have a different information, it would be
and what
good
would the
to know.
basis for that be?
It's well, I think it's written in there. Is my understanding. Let me ask parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Are there provisions in Senate Bill 30 that will require a 2/3 vote of the body for passage for funding of those provisions in Senate Bill 30?
The chair is not advised.
If I may, I think that the only impact is whether it goes into effect immediately. There's not anything in here that wouldn't happen without a 2/3 vote, but for immediate implementation, it would require a 2/3
Okay,
vote.
I appreciate the clarification. We were speaking before about the school safety allotment, and in this bill, you have $1.1 billion allocated for school safety. The big difference, of course, is that in the budget as it left the House, in SB 30 as it left the House, you graciously agreed to an amendment that I put forward that would have put $1.6 billion into the school safety allotment. Again, that would be per student funding. And as it comes back to us, this is $1.1 billion that would go to the TEA, where the TEA would have discretion to decide what grants to give to what district, as opposed to money going directly to the school districts for per student school safety funding. Is that correct?
So importantly, what it does is it allows for us to make sure that those dollars are spent on school safety and, in fact, prioritize the types of school safety projects that are funded. Were it to go into the allotment, there's no assurance as to how that money would be spent.
And of that $1.1 billion, does all of that have to go to school districts, or can TEA keep whatever percentage it deems appropriate?
That money is intended to go to school districts specifically for school safety projects.
Okay, but it's not necessarily the fact that every school district would get money under that $1.1 billion that's allocated under
Certainly,
this
if
bill?
a district chose not to apply for the money, then perhaps they wouldn't receive it.
Or if the application to the agency did not meet the commissioner's
Well,
standards?
definitely, if it was not an appropriate use of the funds, it would not be granted.
Is there criteria somewhere besides what's currently in statute about who would get funding this 1.1 billion?
It's a grant program that would be administered by the TEA, and we could get the rules for that program for you. I don't have those rules.
Okay,
today.
but under rules already that are already part of the agency's rules.
So actually, I think that House Bill 3 may have some guidance in it, which has not yet passed. But there should be a conference committee report within the next 24 hours on House Bill 3 that would provide some further direction to the TEA. But as you know, in statute, we tend to provide statutory limitations or instructions, and yet there are rules that must be then written for the actual implementation of those statutory requirements. And so I think you'll see in House Bill 3 some direction in terms of the grants and how they are to be administered, but I would expect TEA to have rules around that as well.
Under House Bill 3, if it passes, included in it currently is over 40 new employees at TEA and a fleet of cars. Would that come out of the 1.1 billion as well?
I am not sure which fleet of cars or FTEs you're referring to.
Okay. So, but things that are appropriated to the agency under House Bill 3 would come, and not to school districts, that would come out of the 1.1 billion, like the new FTEs, for instance?
It would depend on the strategy. I'm not certain as to, again, what precisely you're referring to. My goal is for this money to go to make our school districts safer, campuses safer for kids.
Ms. Gervin Hawkins, what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a couple questions?
Gentleman yield for questions?
Definitely.
Gentleman yield.
Thank you, Representative Bond. Just a couple quick questions. When we look at the monies that's been put in SB 30 under Health and Human Services, we've got forensic beds, we've got mental health issues and things like that. Will counties be able to have interagency agreements with some of these dollars? Like, for instance, can Bexar County participate by having an interagency agreement at all with the HHS?
And this is for, are you talking about the money to construct the new facilities that would have increased forensic capacity, or?
Well, the new facilities, I think, would be separate.
Correct.
I'm thinking for services.
Yeah, I am not sure what the requirements would be around interagency agreements for those funds.
And so HHS will establish those guidelines and rules?
Yeah. Thanks. I'd be happy to get that information for you.
Okay, just another quick question. Any interagency activity, and the reason I ask, because mental health is so big, and in addressing that, will we have opportunity for some of these dollars to trickle down to some of your nonprofits who have boots on the ground, who's dealing with direct mental health issues, and not just up here, not just dollars up here, but they'll be able to come down? Or is that up to the local community?
You're talking about mental health funding specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the specific program. There are many programs that are not just in Article 2, but are across all articles of the budget. And I'm sure that does impact some nonprofits around the state, but it's not one homogeneous strategy. What provisions are they talking about?
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Bond, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. I move adoption.
Dr. Bottom moves the House adopt the Conference Committee report for SB 30. This is record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Tom voting aye, Dr. Bottom voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 135 ayes and 10 nays, the Conference Committee report for SB 30 is adopted, subject to Article 3, Section 49A of the Texas Constitution. The chair recognizes Mr. Clardy for a motion.
Thank you, Speaker. Members, I move to grant the request of the Senate to appoint a conference committee on SB 2315.
Members of the motion objection, the chair hears none, so ordered. The following conferees, the clerk read the conferees.
House conferees on SB 2315. Clardy, Chair. Button, Lambert, Rainey, Stuckey.
The chair announces the signing of the following in the presence of the House.
Probably here. HB 4062, HB 4106, HB 4415, HB 4456, HB 4538, HB 4550, HB 4645, HB 4660, HB 4714, HB 4758, HB 5066, HB 5178, HB 5307, HB 5309, HB 5312, HB 5316, HB 5322, HB 5332, HB 5333, HB 5334, HB 5337, HB 5340, HB 5372, HB 5373, HB 5377, HB 5386, HB 5389, HB 5414, HB 5415, HCR 26, HB 19, HB 64, HB 139, HB 198, HB 409, HB 422, HB 461, HB 527, HB 611, HB 886, HB 923, HB 969, HB 1133, HB 1163, HB 1357, HB 1597, HB 1598, HB 1649, HB 1673, HB 1710, HB 1730, HB 1759, HB 1766, HB 1903, HB 2060, HB 2187, HB 2201, HB 2259, HB 2333, HB 2488, HB 2512, HB 2555, HB 2620, HB 2626, HB 2715, HB 2741, HB 2816, HB 2839, HB 2850, HB 2878, HB 2900, HB 2975, HB 3097, HB 3159, HB 3191, HB 3207, HB 3232, HB 3235, HB 3257, HB 3335, HB 3419, HB 3469, HB 3556, HB 3603, HB 3908, HB 3981.
Members, the Speaker's desk is clear. If you have any announcements, please bring them down front. Mr. Metcalf moves the House adjourned until 1 p.m. Sunday. Is there objection? Chair hears none. The House stands adjourned.